And at this point, I'd like to hand it over to Andrew Seeger, who is the facilitator for the REL Northeastern Islands Urban School Improvement Alliance, and he is going to kick off our webinar this afternoon. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Peter, and welcome to everybody to this initial bridge event. It's the first public event offered by the Urban School Improvement Alliance under the sponsorship of the Regional Educational Lab for the Northeastern Island. You'll hear more about the Alliance soon from one of the researchers on it. But its members have chosen this as really being a focus for research for the coming 5 years, and wanted to begin with understanding where the research is and where it might then go. So sorry, I just got a message. So we're very gratified by the response here, and are looking forward to some excellent presentations and good discussion to follow. So the agenda after this welcome, there's going to be an overview of the REL itself. It is to feature perhaps Jill, if she gets on in time, our director. If not, I will do that piece. Dave Phillips, one of the two researchers for the Alliance, will then give an overview of the Alliance itself, followed by a featured presentation by Dr. Jeffery Wayman from the University of Texas at Austin. There'll be an opportunity for questions and answers around his talk in particular. And then Brandon Keveney, who's a member of the Urban School Improvement Alliance and also Director of Accountability for the Rochester, New York City School District, will respond and talk about how this works out in practice. And then there'll be an opportunity for online discussion on your part, which Dave Phillips will facilitate. So with that, that's the agenda. I wanted to ask you first to do a poll and let us know what kind of organization you're representing today. So if you would check the relevant box, we'll find out the different organizations we have. As you can see, there's a pretty big mix with something in the range of 20% from districts, 10% from schools, 17% from state education agencies, some education nonprofits, and education service agencies. So really quite a mix of people here. So we hope that this conversation across different organizations and types of organizations and people and across different regions will benefit us all. So with that, we'll move on. So the goals for this webinar are first to introduce the Regional Educational Lab for the Northeast Islands. I'll just tell you a few words about it. And then to introduce the Urban School Improvement Alliance and its purpose. From that, with the presentation, we'll explore recent research on district use to inform instructional decision-making and see how that may inform our work and also our practice and potentially policy too from state education agencies. Then our goal is to present a perspective on how that works out in an urban district implementing data use, and the City of Rochester has been developing a strategy over a number of years, and we want to hear about that. And then we want to engage you as participants in an online discussion on the research. We regret that we can't all have you talking, but we will use the participant to chat for that purpose. So that's those are the goals, and we hope we will achieve them. I'm now going to move on to the introduction. As I said, I'd hoped that Jill Weber, our director, would be able to speak to this, but she was called away to another meeting. She hoped that she'd be out in time, but it's obvious that she's not. So I will talk to that myself. So the Regional Educational Lab is one of the Northeastern Islands, is one of a network of 10 RELs across the country. That's the shorthand, we call them RELs. And this map shows the different with its different colors, shows those different regions. The purpose is to increase the use of evaluation and data to identify problems, to choose programs and strategies, and learn from initiatives. And the focus is for educators at all levels, whether from the state to service agencies, to districts, to schools. And at this time, we are also asked to work very much as closely as possible with practitioners, and are doing that with a series of research alliances. And this particular presentation is on the behalf of one of those alliances. We're funded by the U.S. Department of Education Institute of Education Sciences, which is the part of the U.S. Department of Education responsible for oversight of and promoting of education research and policy related to that. Now, the Regional Educational Lab of Northeastern Islands serves the New England area, New York, and also Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, and we're glad to have people on the call from both Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. We have, as part of this, sorry, I'm missing my slides here. We are primarily out of Education Development Center in Waltham, Massachusetts, which is the prime for this. But we do have two other major partners. One is Learning Innovations at WestEd, and in fact, the two researchers on this project, David Phillips and Anthony Petrosino, whom you'll hear from later, are both from WestEd, and the other is American Institutes for Research. We have a contract which started in February 2012 and runs for 5 years through 2017. So we're still in the early stages of this set of research. We have 8 research alliances in the region. All but 2 of them cover multiple states. The 2 that don't are the one for Puerto Rico and the one for Virgin Islands. The topics that are covered, as you can see from this, include early childhood education, English language learners, college and career readiness, educator effectiveness, rural issues, and this one addresses urban issues. The Puerto Rico one, as you can see, is about dropout prevention, and Virgin Islands is also one on college and career readiness. So without any further ado, I want to introduce you to David Phillips, who will give an overview of the Urban School Improvement Alliance. David, over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Andrew, for the great overview of the REL Northeastern Islands and the work with the alliances that we're doing in general. And I wanted to spend just a few minutes talking specifically to the work of the Urban School Improvement Alliance specifically. So the overall goal of the Urban School Improvement Alliance is to help build capacity among its local education agency members to use and access data to address questions around improving low-performing schools. And the Alliance is collaborating to meet this goal through a number of different avenues. Improving structures and processes that facilitate the pursuit of coherent research agendas within state and local education agencies. And to that end, Alliance members have participated in 2 research agenda development workshops that have led to the creation of a first draft of a long-term research agenda for the group, and I'll talk to that in a bit more detail on the next slide. USIA Urban School Improvement Alliance members and REL Northeastern Island researchers are also collaborating to help facilitate sharing across state and local boundaries to improve data utilization on the topic of low-performing schools. And finally, we're working towards developing capacities that enable districts to use longitudinal data to inform pressing questions of policy and practice. And one way we have begun to start that capacity building process is through workshops on the development of protocols and practices for engaging external researchers. On the next slide, just a little bit more information on our emerging research agenda that, again, as Andrew mentioned, has been developed in collaboration with the Alliance members themselves, most of whom are practitioners who are sort of in the trenches with this work every day. Specific areas of inquiry are developing around the questions of, first off, descriptively, who uses what data? For example, what data is used by principals to inform program choice and resource allocation? What data is currently being used by teachers to inform instruction? What data is currently used by district administrators and school boards to inform policymaking and resource allocation decisions? And also, what is current data practice in school? What does it look like? How is data being used at the school building level to drive instruction? What are the impediments to data use by teachers and administrators? And what are the organizational supports for data use? How are administrators using data to make decisions? What is best practice on how districts structure themselves so data is utilized for district and policy decisions? What are the essential organizational capacities that must be retained for effective use of data to inform policy and practice? And finally, on the front end of our research agenda are what are the skill building activities needed for effective data use? How are staff skill levels developed to make meaning of what's available at all levels in a district organization? What support and structures are necessary? And then through some of this descriptive research that we are thinking about on this research agenda, for the first couple of years, we hope to move into some actual correlational looks at potential relationships between structures, data use, and ultimately student achievement. So these are just a handful of questions of interest the group is beginning to gel around. We expect that the research agenda will continue to develop over time, reflecting the needs of the Alliance in an ever-evolving policy context. And Andrew will talk to this again at the conclusion of our webinar today, but I also wanted to mention some additional information is available on the Urban School Improvement Alliance website. And the links are available both in the participant chat as well as on the slide. From the site, if you are interested, you may sign up for the REL Northeast and Islands newsletter that includes research announcements and event announcements around possible areas of interest. And this is not just for the Urban School Improvement Alliance, but there's a number of categories of interest that folks can sign up for to receive additional information on REL work. You may also contact Andrew Seeger, Anthony Petrosino, or myself with questions regarding the Alliance in general, or if you work in the REL Northeast and Islands region with inquiries about involving yourself or your organization in the Alliance or its research going forward. So that's a brief summary of the work of the Urban School Improvement Alliance, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. And I'm now going to turn this presentation back over to Andrew Seeger, who will be introducing our esteemed speaker, Dr. Jeffery Wayman.
Thanks, David. So I'm going to introduce both of our speakers. Jeff Wayman, he was suggested to us specifically by another member of our Alliance Planning Group, David Weinberger, who's on this session today. And he suggested that we follow up with Jeff, and we're very glad we did so. Jeff Wayman is an assistant professor at the Department of Educational Administration, as you heard, at the University of Texas at Austin. His research focuses on the effective use of data for school improvement, including efficient structures for creating data-informed school districts, the software that delivers student data to educators, effective leadership for data use, and systemic supports that enable widespread teacher use of student data. Dr. Wayman's current research is a 3-year study funded by the Spencer Foundation titled The Data-Informed District, Implementation and Effects of a District-Wide Data Initiative. And we're going to learn a lot about that today. In this project, Dr. Wayman and his research team are working with 3 districts to help them become data-informed. In addition to this work, in 2008, Dr. Wayman received the Jack A. Culbertson Award from the University Council for Education Administration. This award is given to a junior professor for significant contributions to the field of education administration. Prior to joining the UT faculty, Dr. Wayman worked for Johns Hopkins University at the Center for Social Organization of Schools, and also at Colorado State University in the area of prevention research. Finally, he wanted to make sure that we knew that you knew that he was a junior high math teacher in Kansas City and also in Salt Lake City. So we were very happy to have him working with us. Brandon Kevney is Director of Accountability at Rochester City School District in Rochester, New York. As a member of the district's Office of Accountability, Brandon contributes to the team by coordinating the reporting of data to the New York State Education Department, monitoring district and school performance, leading research projects about student performance, and working on various district-based analyses. Prior to working in the Office of Accountability, Dr. Kevney worked for the State University of New York College at Brockport in the Education and Human Development Department, where he taught methodology and research methods and instructional practice. While working at SUNY Brockport, Dr. Kevney got his doctorate of education at the University of Rochester's Margaret Warner Graduate School. In addition to his experience in district administration, Dr. Kevney has extensive experience teaching students with special needs in both rural and urban settings. So we're very glad to have them and delighted that they could be part of this presentation. With that, I'm going to hand you over to our featured speaker, Jeff Wayman.
Andrew, thanks a lot. Hi, everybody. I'm always struck by webinars because I'm giving a talk right now to 129 people, and I get dead silence on the other end. So that's always interesting for webinars. I guess it's not entirely unlike some of the classes I teach, right? That's the definition of a professor, is somebody who talks in somebody else's sleep. So anyway, enough of that. I'm not telling the audience anything new when I say that the effective use of educational data is an important issue. More and more attention is paid to educational data. And in fact, you all know, those of you in the school settings, that schools are increasingly asked to do more. Unfortunately, effective data use that informs educational improvement is hard to do. And that's why I've studied this topic for the last 10 years, from my days at Johns Hopkins up through my time here at the University of Texas. I've conducted a number of research projects on this thing that I call the data-informed district in an attempt to find solutions to this problem. And today I'm going to talk to you about what the field has learned, talk to you about my research, and my latest thinking on data use. So for today's talk, we're first going to get some preliminary things out of the way. We're going to set some definitions. I'm going to describe to you what I mean by the data-informed district. Then we'll get to the main point of the talk, which is going to be to discuss 5 components of the data-informed district. So first off, let's talk about what we mean by student data. Now, when data is brought into the conversation, often people think of formal assessments. So they think of state assessments or formative assessments, these things that will predict how the student's going to do on the state test, maybe local assessments or other forms of interim assessments that give you periodic information about student learning. And people often stop thinking about data, or people often stop with assessments when they're defining data. But I want to bring about a broader definition of data into our discussion today. When I think of data, I think of anything that helps an educator know more about student learning, know more about their students and what's going on. So, yeah, data has to do with assessments. That's part of the puzzle. But there's so much more to it than that. There's the quizzes or tests that a teacher might make up. There are teacher observations. There's information based on demographic data, parental information, ILP, a whole host of things. Anything that helps an educator know more about their students' learning is data in my book. So that's what we mean by data. Next, we need to talk about what purpose we're going to use data for. Often when people talk about data use, they have a purpose in mind, but they don't tell everybody what that is. And it's not that it's a secret. They just assume that everybody knows what they mean by data use. In reality, there are a lot of different purposes for data use. For instance, there's accountability reporting and forecasting. You could use data for that. You could use data for staffing. You can use data for bus schedules, for financial stuff. You can sort students, group them. You can use data on an hourly basis if you want to look at their student learning needs. Point is that there are a lot of different purposes for data, and each purpose brings about its own set of practices that are going to make data use most effective. Today, we're going to focus on the purpose of data for instructional improvement. So when we ask data use for what, we mean instructional improvement. Now I want to talk to you a little bit about the data-informed district. So as Andrew mentioned, I'm an old junior high teacher. I taught junior high math, if that's not already really clear. To be honest with you, when I was a teacher, my view of the district was that the thing they could do the most to help me was leave me alone. And I know a lot of teachers believe that too. When I started researching this data use stuff, I came to learn very quickly that although my interest was really in how teachers can use this best, that teachers were going to be able to use data best when they were supported by the district and when the district was set up in a way to where the entire district was a learning organization. So I started thinking about and pressing on this thing that I call the data-informed district. And the idea behind the data-informed district is that data use shouldn't be something just that this teacher or that this pocket of teachers or that this school does, that it should be something that goes throughout the district. And it should be done in a way to where the entire district, everybody in the district, their practice gets better, so the kids learn more. So in the data-informed district, what that means is that the uses of data are about alignment, they're about integration, they're about collaboration. In the data-informed district, data are used in the course of everyday work, not in addition to everyday work. So I'm not interested in data use that causes teachers or principals or central office workers to have to run off during their lunch period and do this, or to have to run off on a Saturday afternoon and meet with the rest of their team about this. We use information in our everyday lives throughout the course of what we're doing, and that's how I want to see data happen in the data-informed district. In the data-informed district, it's the structures and practices that develop culture. Often it's spoken of, well, we need to build a culture of data use, and I believe that that happens whenever you set up the structures and practices, and you turn around one day and you're like, hey, because of the way we've been doing things, we have a data-informed culture. One definition of culture is the way we do things when nobody's looking, and I think that applies here. Data don't drive nothing. You won't hear me use the term data-driven instruction or data-driven decision-making, because that, to me, that implies that the data are causing something to happen. It's professional judgment that actually drives what's going on. The data just inform the professional judgment. Finally, I'll say in the data-informed district, the individual and the system reciprocally support each other. So now that we have those things set down, let's get into the meat of our talk. We're going to talk about 5 aspects of the data-informed district. There are many more than 5, but I've chosen 5 to speak of today. Common understandings, collaboration, data systems, professional learning, and principal leadership. And for each one of these, we'll show a slide that talks about what the research says, and then we'll show a slide that talks about what the roadblocks and facilitators are to getting this done. So let's first begin to talk about common understandings. Common understandings are so important if you're going to use data effectively. In fact, I'm basing the rest of my talk on common understandings. You'll hear me refer back to this frequently. Think about it. In your educational career, how often have you sat down with your fellow teachers or your fellow educators and had a discussion about what you mean by teaching and learning and learned what somebody else meant by teaching and learning? We do a funny thing in data use in that we measure learning, but we haven't ever really defined what learning is. What is learning? I don't know, but we're going to measure it. And so it's important to have these discussions about what we mean by teaching and learning and how data are going to inform that. when you do this, it's not that everybody has to come into lockstep agreement on what teaching and learning are. Rather, you need to engage in what Sengi talked about was shared mental models. We need to understand where each other's coming from in terms of teaching and learning and the use of data, and we need to look for ways that we overlap. And the more we understand about each other, the more we'll find we have in common, the more we can build something together. Consequently, it's important to understand that it's the process that's important. This process of actually going through these conversations will help you a lot when you come to use data. It's not that you don't write stuff down. Our work shows that you need to engage in this process. You need to write down the happenings and the results that you got of the process, and you need to codify it and put it into the fabric of your work. But while you're doing this, you need to remember that these things are going to change as you go along. You know, as we grow as educators, as we grow as a data using culture, as our organization learns more, as the kids change, as life around us change. These common understandings are organic. They're constantly changing. So you need to revisit this frequently. So that's what the research says about common understandings. Let's talk about the roadblocks and facilitators. So you decide you're going to engage in some discussions about common understandings, and you find some roadblocks in your way. One of them is that educators may initially hold widely divergent perspectives on teaching and learning. That's okay. Most of us have a core sense about education that we got in it to help kids, and that's a starting point. Even if it seems initially discouraging that people are so divergent from each other, you keep having these conversations and you will find common ground. Another roadblock is that almost always teams or schools or groups have never engaged in this. So it's very unfamiliar to them and sometimes a little bit uncomfortable at the start. The final roadblock I'll mention is that sometimes nobody wants to do the work. It's a hard thing to convince people that we need to talk about our common understandings whenever they've got lesson plans due tomorrow, when they've got 5 parents breathing down their throats, breathing down their necks. It's sometimes hard to see the value in this. And the facilitators that I'm going to discuss will help you with that. One facilitator is, well, the main thing that I'm going to talk about in terms of facilitators is a thing that we've written about called calibration. I started writing about this in 2006. And calibration is this idea that you can be in constant conversation about things about our practice that will help us get on the same page and calibrate our work. And so we've come up with calibration exercises that we've used with districts that will help people have these conversations. One that we recently did with a district that we're working on in our Spencer project involved having groups of people discuss the answers to 4 questions that were based on these common assessments that they were trying to write in their districts. That brings us to the second facilitator, which is it probably doesn't matter what the conversations are as much as it does that it's relevant to their work. That, whenever nobody wants to do this work, that's how you get them on board, is you talk about something that they're going to have to deal with tomorrow. What we found with the school organizations that have implemented this is that even the resistors will find great value in collaboration, or in calibration. People that we've talked to one year that say, I hate data use is stupid, nobody needs to tell me what to do, and so on. We've gone back the next year and hear these people talking, maybe not singing the praises of data, but at least talking about how their practice has improved based on some things that they did as a result of using data. So that tells us where my thinking is on common understandings. Let's go ahead and talk now a little bit about collaboration. Collaboration is an interesting thing because the final bullet that you have there says the collaboration is the lifeblood of school data use, and I really believe that. It's interesting because education is such an autonomous profession, right? You know, when I was teaching and the bell rang at 8:10 and I closed the door, it was just the kids and I. And you do so much of it alone, yet collaboration is the way that people really advance and that people grow. And we're finding with a topic that's so unfamiliar, like data, that people really do need to collaborate. And in fact, however important I think collaboration is, I'm always surprised that it's more important than I thought it was. So what does the research tell us? Collaboration works best when it's based on common expectations and common understandings. To the degree that we can get on the same page, then we can work better in collaboration. And if you think back to your collaborations that didn't work, often they came down because you didn't have a common purpose. You had maybe divergent purposes, or maybe you just didn't know where each other was coming from. Collaboration has to be structured. So we're talking about structures that would be during the school day. So as a principal or as a district, you don't just tell your teachers, well, go collaborate, go find some time to collaborate. In contexts like that, we hear of teachers saying, well, I took some of my plan period, or I met with this teacher over lunch, and we heard them doing things that aren't really sustainable. Instead, you have to carve that time out, and you have to dedicate it to data use. So that time needs to be carved out. But even as hard as it is to carve out time in a school day, I'll tell you this, carving out that time is the easy part, because the really hard part is structuring what they do within that collaboration. You can have all the time you want to for collaboration. We're seeing a lot of instances where the time has been carved out, but the collaboration itself is aimless, and you might as well not be doing it at that point. Another thing that the research suggests is that you need to make sure that people collaborate together who wouldn't have usually collaborated. So, yeah, it's easy to get all the 7th grade math teachers to collaborate, but can you help the 7th grade math teacher collaborate with the counselor or the 8th grade English teacher? Or are there ways that you can find that where they can collaborate and boost their creativity? Roadblocks and facilitators for collaboration. One roadblock, it's a major one, is the school has no structured collaboration. I can't tell you how many times we've seen that. The people are just expected to collaborate. And not only do those collaborations happen infrequently and often unsustainably, but the nature of them is that the educators just end up collaborating with people that they would have collaborated with in the first place. They collaborate with their friends and people that they already talk to. And so there's not a lot of true information sharing. As I mentioned, collaborative time can be aimless. I spoke to someone recently where their district instituted late starts during the school year periodically, but there was no direction on what would happen once those late starts happened. So they had their hour for late start, and they were expected to get together, and people were grading papers and talking about the students and doing other things which were useful. But this district had intended those to be about using data. Again, I'll note that if you don't have some basis for common understandings, then often your collaboration doesn't go as well as you wanted it to. So those roadblocks can be fixed up with these facilitators. One facilitator is that you build the structures into their everyday work. Now, often this is done through a plan period, and that's fine, or by creating an extra plan period. That's fine. But also, principals and district leaders can look for ways that teachers are doing their work in which a collaboration would be really helpful. And that can be anything from team teaching to having teachers observe each other and then discuss what they find. There are a lot of different ways that you can do that. A biggie is to identify data and problems and things that we're going to work on that are immediately relevant to educators' work. As those people out there that have been teachers or are currently teachers, you can attest to the fact that there's nothing worse than having to take your time away to do something that you aren't going to get to use tomorrow or next week because you forget it. It just goes away. So it needs to be immediately relevant to the educator's work. Finally, I'll say that these calibration activities that I mentioned before are a really good way to get people collaborating. It probably doesn't matter exactly what they collaborate about around data. It matters that they're working together and sharing data with each other and best of all, having discussions about what they think the data means for their practice. And if you can get them talking about what the data means for their practice and about teaching and learning, then you're in pretty good shape. So let's move on to data systems. My gosh, I could probably do an hour on these two slides. So I'll try to cut this down into a reasonable amount of time. The research says some things that aren't so surprising, but they are persistently problematic. And so there's still things that we need to solve. The research says that everybody should have access to a comprehensive store of data, and it should be integrated, and it should be available right when you want it. I had a district administrator say one time that the data ought to be like a fountain drink. You ought to just go up and get what you want. The research says that data systems should fit in with the work, the everyday work of an educator, and they should support that work. This brings me to a point that not a lot of people are talking about, but I think it's important. I think we've essentially solved the technological problem. Oh, you know, we can do better with the technology behind data systems, and the people that are building data systems now will tell you a host of things that they wish the systems could do better. But really, you know, for the last 5 years, and a study that Barbara Means out of SRI did showed this, almost all schools in the United States have some sort of data system, and most of them have some sort of integration. All right, it may not be what I want it to look like, but it's technologically available. So I think we've solved most of the technological problem. I think the problem we haven't solved is the human part. That is, if we put a perfectly technologically advanced data system in a school, it still may not be used well, because there are so many other things that go along with the technology that you have to have going on in a school to make sure that this gets used. In fact, these other 4 components that I'm talking about are quite a bit of it. One of the things that we found in our research, there's some really good data about it in Vincent Cho's dissertation, is that educators make sense of their data systems based on their notions about data. We've got some really good data that is going to be published soon that shows that even with 2 exactly identical data systems, the ideas and definitions that a teacher has about what data are and what data should be used for are going to drive what they see in that system. So I think that data use are for this and this and this. You think that data and data use is for this and this and this, and we have the exact same systems. We're going to view those systems differently. We're going to find different things in there, and we're going to define those systems differently. So that's one example of the human part that we have to take care of, and nobody's paying any attention to people's notions about data. Finally, I'll say that the training for system use, I think, is misguided. And almost all across the board, I think it's misguided, because what I see continually is when a data system is rolled out, the training is on how to use the data system. Here are the features of the data system. Here's how you would use the data system. That's not what matters. What we need to train on is the data themselves. Here is a set of data that you can use to inform your practice and educate your kids better. Here are the properties of those data. Here's what you can do with them. Here's what you can't do with them. Once you find these results, here are the types of changes you might make in your practice. And oh, by the way, here is a tool, a data system that might help you do that. Let me show you 2 or 3 things that will help you access these data better. So my attitude is you don't train on the system. You train on the data use and train on the data themselves. So let's talk about some roadblocks and facilitators. The roadblocks are pretty common. You guys probably could have listed these all on your own, that you know, the system doesn't have what the educators want. We have all encountered that, where we roll out a nice new system, and the thing we hear so much is, wow, the system's great, it's better than what we had, but boy, I wish it had this. I really wanted it to do this. I should say that often that's because districts buy data systems without finding out how their people use data, and so essentially they, rather than having some of these calibration exercises and finding out, you know, what we mean by teaching and learning in our district, districts will buy a system and get done with it and say, okay, what will this system let us do? Instead of saying, okay, what do we need a system to do, and tailoring it to that. The data system often isn't user-friendly. In fact, sometimes it's user-hostile. You ought to be able to sit down at any data system and have even the most novice technology person understand what's going on with it. Here's a big one, is the data system takes too much time. Educators have a short fuse for this stuff because they have been told for the last 50 years that technology is going to change their lives. And educators, we have another study that showed how educators couch this in terms of their risk or their time that they're going to have to take to do this. And it's the same thing as any of us would do. I'll learn this, I'll invest some time in it if I know it's going to help. If I'm not 100% sure it's going to help, then I may not want to invest much time in it. So facilitators, some of them are pretty obvious. Integrated data systems are critical. You need a one-stop shop where somebody can sit down and use the system. It may have 50 systems underlying it, but people need to be able to get all the data that they want connected with just a few clicks and not a million passwords. User-friendly systems. We're still working on that. There's been some good work done in user-friendly systems, but now with Web 2.0 and social networking and all that, much of this has changed, and most data systems haven't followed. So the definition of user-friendly is probably different than it was even 2 or 3 years ago. Finally, I'll say that this is that data systems have to be centered around the work of the educator. People that build data systems need to understand what work the educator does so that we can support it, not that the work is tailored to the data system. So let's move on to professional learning. Professional learning is to me, one of the most interesting areas of data use right now, because it's so perpendicular right now to what teachers want and need. JoBeth Jimerson did a dissertation, and we showed in that dissertation that teachers were very clear on what they needed from professional learning, and it lined up exactly with the research. The people delivering the professional learning in the districts also listed those components that it needed to be, yet what was actually delivered was the complete opposite. So, teachers and the deliverers said, yeah, it needs to be small, it needs to be relevant, it needs to be coherent, it needs to be something that they can use soon, and so on. Yet, what were they getting, and what did they continue to get? Instead of small, they get large convocations. Instead of immediately relevant, they get it on a topic that somebody else chose. Instead of being able to use it tomorrow, they get it maybe in May, and they're expected to use it in August, if at all. And the solutions to this are not immediately clear because it's not that nobody knows what they're doing. There are a lot of influences on it, policy and some other things, but it's why I find professional learning particularly interesting. You can see some of this in my bullets on professional learning. The professional learning that we give, as I said, must be immediately useful, but most of it isn't. We know that professional learning is most effective when it's delivered in small settings. Again, most of it isn't. Here's something that not a lot of people are doing, but it's really, really useful, is to deliver professional learning during collaborative time. These collaborations that I was talking about earlier that not only can be used to discuss, some of our meanings about teaching and learning and be able to springboard us to issues of practice, that's a good time to engage in professional learning. And in doing so, I've come to the conclusion that we need to quit worrying about trying to create experts on data use. Instead, we need to be trying to create expertise. Don't worry about experts. Think about the ways teachers connect with each other. A teacher in a school, when they need to know something about how to deliver this social studies lesson or this particular unit on fractions, they don't call up the person at the district who knows everything there is to know about teaching. There aren't just a set of 3 or 4 or 10 experts that they call up. You walk down the hall. You walk into the teacher's lounge. You go find somebody else who may have that nugget of expertise. And that's the way teachers work, is they seek out pieces of expertise in all sorts of different colleagues. And so we're really focusing on this idea of expertise instead of experts. It helps build capacity. It helps build teacher capacity to do this stuff. If everybody is capable of providing this, it goes to something that I've thought about before, which is the idea of learning groups. You know, who's in my learning group? Who do I turn to when I need to know things? And that changes depending on the topic. So you need a lot of different areas of expertise. Finally, I'll say that this article that we currently have under revision, Jo Beth Jimerson and I, talks about the reciprocal nature of professional learning among individuals, collectives, and organizations. So I, as a teacher, my teacher group, and the school all feed into each other as far as professional learning goes. So let's talk about some roadblocks and facilitators. Some of the roadblocks are really obvious, and many of you are living these roadblocks. The time lag between learning and application is critical. One of our districts trained on their data system, which I kind of ground my teeth about, but they trained on their data system in May and then wondered why nobody knew how to log on to it in August. The time lag was killer. You talk about your summer learning loss for students. It happens for teachers also. As we talked about, professional learning sometimes isn't tailored to people's immediate needs. In fact, very rarely do districts go out and really try to find out what their people need in professional learning and then try to deliver that. There are some good surveys that are being done, but we can do better. And one of the other roadblocks that we didn't talk about is sometimes it takes extra time to do professional learning. You know, that you have to go get it during the summer or over a weekend or so on. Facilitators that can solve that is perhaps the simplest thing. You identify content that can be used tomorrow. Every piece of work that we've done with our districts has been based on what we learned about their needs. And we sat down and said, okay, what did they tell us what's the fire that they got to put out tomorrow? And we said, how about we work with you on this? And you can do that with your educators also. Everybody is going to be more interested in something they can use tomorrow. As I mentioned, you need to develop expertise throughout the district. So instead of trying to develop experts, although experts may be helpful, look to build capacity in each and every person for something. Everybody can be a go-to person for something, whether you define that formally or whether your capacity building is done well enough that you can just turn your people loose. Finally, I'll say that this idea of learning within everyday work, I'll be honest with you, I don't yet know enough about that, but that's something that we're going to learn more about over the next 3 to 5 years. We've got to figure out a way to take professional development out of stadium seating auditoriums and get it into the collaborative work environment. There's no reason why people can't learn within their everyday work. So let's talk about our final element here, which is principal leadership. Okay, here's the truth. Data use lives and dies in the principal's office. Now, as I've mentioned, I'm most interested in teachers doing this, and I do believe that any data initiative will fail if it doesn't look to involve all the teachers, because that's the way that you're going to get it embedded into the culture. But I also know that if you don't get your principals on board, and if you don't get principals to leading entire faculties in doing this, that your data initiative will either fail or be hollow. And it's the problem that I see anytime I see problems in data use in a school, I can almost always trace it back to the principals. And anytime I see it going well, I can almost always trace that back to the principals. So principals are critical. Here's what I read the research to tell me, and what I know our own research has told me, that it's probably more important to teach your principals strategies for leading their faculty in using data than it is even to get them good data use skills. I'm not saying it's not important for a principal to know what the numbers mean and be able to use the data. It is. But that's not enough. And too often, principals are prepared, when they do get prepared, they're prepared on knowing what the test scores mean and how to use those and all that. They aren't often prepared to lead their faculties with different strategies. So I teach a class for future principals in database decision making, and I base that class now on different strategies. We're getting ready to submit an article. We did a conference paper on it where we identified 12 strategies that the research says that principals need to be able to have to lead their faculty in using data. I listed a few of them here, such as focusing on the larger context, facilitating collaboration, and all these things. You guys can read those. What we've done in this article and what I do in this class is we go into each strategy and say, okay, how could this help the principal? How can the principal employ this? And so on. The thing is, it probably, in any given situation, there probably isn't one right strategy that principal would absolutely need. It probably doesn't matter what they work on, just that they work on something, because our data show that principals are typically employing maybe 1, 2, or 3 of these, maybe, and that's in a good context. This research was born out of the nth recommendation that I gave a district, which is you've got to train your principals more. And they'd say, well, what are you talking about? Well, I'd say, you need more leadership strategies. Well, what types of leadership strategies? And we'd say, oh, it's like facilitating collaboration or structuring time or goal setting, and then ... We'd trail off. So we wrote this article so that I could hand this to them and say, here's what I'm talking about, and here's the research behind it, and here's what our data show us. And I can tell you that our data have shown me that that most principals are not employing many leadership strategies. So let's talk about roadblocks and facilitators for principal leadership. One roadblock is the principal is disengaged. We see this a lot, that the principal is hoping that data use will happen through somebody else, and often that's the case. Sometimes this is delegated, but sometimes the principal is completely disengaged from their faculty about their data use. Other times, we've seen principals focus almost entirely on state tests. Now, I get that. Not doing well on state tests can get you fired, and so I totally get that. But your job isn't just to do well on state tests. It's to teach kids. State tests are a piece of that, and they are an important piece, and they are something you should focus on in today's world. It just can't be the only thing. And so it's a roadblock when all the principal cares about is state tests. Care about teaching and learning, care about the state tests, and it will all happen together. Another roadblock is that sometimes the principal style is not collaborative but top-down. Now, I can imagine, and I guess I have seen a couple of times where a top-down style did work well, but I've seen many more styles for leading faculty that were collaborative, where the principal sat with a team and worked with them on this, either as a participant or as a leader in many different roles. So those are the roadblocks. Facilitators, the number one facilitator is for the district to admit they got a problem. And I have found, I'm not sure I've ever seen a district address this as intensely as I would want them to. Any district we've ever worked with, we've given that recommendation that essentially says your principals are sorely lacking these skills. It's not their fault, but you got to teach them more of these skills. And no district has undertaken it that I've worked with. So I think that's one facilitator, is to admit that your principals need help and do it kindly. This is not the principal's fault. You don't get many classes on how to do this stuff. Unless you have the misfortune of taking my class, you may never have a class on this. We don't prepare principals well for this, is what I'm saying. So you're probably going to need to do it at the district level. Another facilitator is that you roll up your sleeves, you get into it, and you say, we're going to teach you the skills that you need, but we're going to make you learn at least one every year. Mandate that they pick up on one of these. Work with them. One of the things about data use that strikes me, whether it's professional learning, principal preparation, or any of this, is that we tell our teachers that they need to meet their kids where they are. But we rarely do that for our educators. Meet the principals where they are. Find out what skill they want to work on and work on it with them. But don't flood them. Pick one and mandate it. Finally, I'll say that principals are human beings. They only have 24 hours in their day, and hopefully they're sleeping and eating and showering and playing with their kids and going to ball games and doing things that make a healthy, rounded person. So keep their data responsibilities workable. What I see that has typically happened is that districts went to principals and went, I know you're already working 9 billion hours a week, but here's this data stuff. See that it happens. And principals, like anybody else, have to make choices. So help them make good choices. So that's what I had to say to you all. I'd be excited to engage with any of you on this in further conversation. There are all sorts of ways to find me here. You saw my email address and my two URLs for websites on the first slide. One of the things I want to draw attention to is this Facebook page that I started a couple of months ago. It's the lowest link there. Not the lowest link, it's the one on the bottom. And that's a place where we're having discussions about this stuff. I post things every now and then. Other people post things. I just had a lady from the Netherlands post about a conference that she's at in Spain and had some really interesting points about data use. So there's a lot of learning going on over there. I invite you to participate in that. Any publications that I have out, anything I've written, is on my data use page there. So not the Facebook page, but the edadmin page. So you can go find anything that I've written there. And if you have questions, email me. So with that, I will turn it back over to our REL people. And thank you very much for listening.
Well, thanks a lot, Jeff. This is Anthony Petrosino. I'm a researcher that works on the USIA. Really appreciated that presentation, and there's certainly a lot of great reaction from the audience. And we wanted to have a little bit of time here for some clarifying questions, and quite a few came in while you were speaking, Jeff, so I'm going to pose these to you. And feel free, folks in the audience that would like to ask any other questions, we'll either get to them now or we'll certainly get back to you if, either later in the webinar or offline. But one of the frequent questions that came up, Jeff, was if you had good examples of calibrating activities.
Yeah, I've got a couple of them that kind of highlight it. One of them is one that we drew from Doug Reeves's work. Doug Reeves talks about an adult science fair where the teachers work on a problem, and then some sort of problem to do with their practice, and then they present it to other teachers. They, in some cases, actually put up posters like you would at a science fair, and people walk around and see it. We've envisioned that sort of thing happening for data use. Maybe in a school, we're all working on some common problem, and teams of teachers maybe discuss how they would solve this problem, come up with a little presentation, and get these conversations going with each other. That can be a calibration activity, because in order to solve these problems, you've got to talk about teaching and learning and data use. Another example, I can say a little more about the one that we did with our district. We pulled in this district, we pulled in principals and 2 to 3 person teams that the principals brought with them. And we said, okay, you guys are working on these common assessments. You're wanting to build common assessments across your district. But let's first talk about the sorts of things that you want to know from those common assessments. And we gave them 4 questions. Question 1, what I think it was something along the lines of what sorts of things are important for your students to know. Talk about 10 minutes about that, and they wrote their results on sticky poster paper. Question number 2 was something on the order of, okay, how would you know that when you saw it? You want your students to learn these things. How are you going to know that when you see it? And they imagined ways that they could assess that. And it really brought out some good information. Besides the fact that they got to talking to each other about teaching and learning, some of the suggestions we got were just phenomenal, stuff that we or the district people wouldn't have thought of. So those are a couple of examples that might be helpful. I hope that was helpful to the people who are asking those questions.
That's great, Jeff. And there's been quite a few links to your publications, and do those also cover this in more detail?
Yes and no. The adult science fair, I think we wrote about that in a 2006 publication. called collaborative data teams. The most recent thing that I talked about that we worked with our districts, we only did that recently, and I haven't yet written about that. But if people want to access my reports and writings that have data-informed district in the title, you will get bits and pieces of this calibration stuff. One of the things I want to produce from this project is an article that is solely about calibration.
Well, that would be very helpful. I could see that people are looking for ways to apply what you're talking about in their districts and schools. And one question that came up was, how do we teach principals data literacy on the job? If you could, had any suggestions for that.
Yeah, it's a good question. One thing that I'll say is that if we're going to think about data literacy, we've got to define it up front, what we mean by data literacy. And in April, I was at a conference where we spent 2 days trying to define data literacy. And it's harder than you think, not because people can't come up with a definition, but because there's so many definitions. So I'll use the definition of data literacy being understanding the properties of data and how you can use them to inform your practice. Well, it's a pretty broad definition. Teaching that to principals on the job, I think, can be done a few ways. Right now, my most preferred method would be to, in a district that had the capacity, would be to specify people to come out and work with the principals in small pieces on this. Again, meet them where they are and try to help them build things that will work in their own context. Districts that don't have that capacity, by the way, I understand I just recommended sending experts out when I made a big production out of saying expertise, not experts. This is a case where I think experts will work. But in districts that don't have that capacity, I think you get the principals together and you get them to talking about the things that they need to know. I guess I will leave it at that and ask if that is sufficient or if I need to have further commentary.
No, I think that's very good, Jeff. And to clarify, another question that came in under calibration is that would a calibration activity does it fall under inquiry teams whereby groups of teachers are addressing an issue and the culmination of that inquiry is to present their findings? Yeah,
that's a great example. As I conceive of this calibration thing, it can happen in almost any activity. Anything that you have that would foster discussion, that would make us think about and share, what we need to know about teaching and learning and how we're going to affect our practice, that can happen in all of those things. So inquiry teams are a great place to have this happen.
Terrific. Early on in your presentation, Jeff, you talked about teachers having different notions of data and wondered if you might elaborate on what those might be.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. When we first started researching this stuff, when we first started doing district-wide interviews, I'd say for probably 3 or 4 years, we heard a large chorus of data, don't tell me anything I don't already know. I don't need this, and so on. We have seen a gradual shift in the way teachers talk about this, partly because they've become more accustomed to it and that teachers have begun to see ways that data can help their practice. They still often don't like it because they think there are other things that can help them more, but they speak of it differently now. Another reason is that district messages about data have become clearer. So to answer your question, an example of different notions that teachers might have about data could be data are to be used for state test purposes. Data are things that data are pieces of information that I can pull out of anywhere. Data involve only the state test scores and the predictive assessments that tell me about the state test scores. I define data as any piece of information that will inform my learning. All of these things can be a wide range of the notions that they have about data, but often we're finding that they are molded by the message the district sends out. I'll give you a couple of examples. We have 2 districts that we worked with. One of them was a very, very high achieving district. The other was a mid to low achieving district. The mid to low achieving district made no bones about it. Data in our district are going to be about test scores. We are going to improve test scores. Now, we're going to improve teaching and learning, and it's going to reflect on the test scores, but they are about test scores. In the really high achieving district, the message from the district wasn't so clear, but the attitude was, well, data are about test scores. Interestingly, in the low achieving district, they use data a lot because they're like, well, we got to get our test scores up, and we're going to try to improve our teaching based on this. So they use data a lot under this message that data was about test scores. The other district with the same definition, data are about test scores, and our kids all pass the state test, so we don't need to use data. Different manifestations based on the same narrow definition of data, but you would work with those much, much differently. I know that this was kind of a long-winded answer, but I'll close it by saying that if I were working with a district, one of the things I would try to do would be to work with the teachers in a reciprocal way on building notions about what data are and try to get something in common across our district about what data are and how we're going to be using them.
Thanks for that, Jeff. And this is probably a little bit of another complex question, but what would you say are the components of good integrated data systems?
Tell me more about what you mean, please, by components.
Elements or the characteristics of, you had mentioned in one of your 5 characteristics of the data-informed district was about data systems, and it had the bullet about integrated data systems, and the question that came in was, what does that actually mean?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. In its most basic sense, it means that systems talk to each other. Early on, probably 5-8 years ago, when I would go out and see systems, I'd see a district that had a whole bunch of different systems: a special education system, a student information system that handled attendance and all this, a grade book, a system that only had the state test scores, a system that had the predictive tests that they gave, a system like Renaissance Learning or something that gave STAR tests. And all these things would be separate. And a teacher or a principal would say, gosh, I just wish I could look at my kids' Renaissance Learning assessments and their NWEA assessments and their state test scores and find out if the kids who are absent too much are having trouble on these. They wanted to link all these up. So that sort of integration is just critical to be able to get these things to talk to each other. That's more common now than it was 5 years ago, but still, almost always I see the special ed system left out. You know, a district will say, yeah, we got this data warehouse, we can integrate everything. Where's special ed data? Oh, that's over here in this other system. We don't have that included. So that sort of integration is important. There's another form of integration that's a little more abstract, which is that that a system ought to be using consistent visual elements across the system. So it shouldn't be switching a lot from drop-down menus to links or ways that you ask of the data.
That's very helpful, Jeff, and really appreciate that. There's obviously been quite a bit of chat discussion about the calibration and the exercises, and I think one comment that came up in the question was, what if you can't get commonality amongst the people that are meeting? Can a calibration exercise still take place?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm in doing calibration, what we've seen is that you don't have to come to granular forms of commonality. It's the process. It's the discussions. You know, if Anthony and I have different ideas of what teaching and learning are, okay. You know, if we have different ideas that, you know, if we will never agree on exactly what teaching and learning are, that's perfectly fine. What isn't fine is if I don't understand what his perspectives are. And what isn't fine if he's working on a team with me and we're talking about teaching and learning in different ways and we never understood each other. Now, I believe or what I have seen is that there actually is more commonality than many educators would believe there is, because at the core of this, we all got into this because we wanted to help kids. So there's common thing number one. But I think it's important in doing calibration and in arriving at common understandings to recognize that every educator has their own agency. They've got their own autonomy. They have their own ideas of things. And we can't erase that. In fact, we have to build on that. I just think that we can, in fact, I know we can, build on it by having these discussions and finding where our differences overlap. There's an article on my website called Organizational Considerations in the Data-Informed District, where we have a section called Common Understandings that talk in more detail about this. But I want to be clear. I think differences are important, and I think they're good, and I think it's the process that's important here.
Great, Jeff. Really appreciate your responses, and thank you, everybody, for your questions, and we certainly haven't forgotten the ones that we didn't get to. But we do want to move on now, and I'll turn it back to Andrew as you get ready to facilitate the next part of the agenda.
Take it away.
So I now want to turn over to, thanks so much, Peter, to Brandon Keaveney, Director of Accountability at the Rochester City School District in Rochester, New York. He's, as I said it before, a member of the Urban School Improvement Alliance, and we're very happy and pleased that he was able to take time and willing to take a time out of his very busy schedule to make this presentation. So, Brandon, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be speaking with colleagues across the country about the data journey that has taken place here in Rochester, New York. And referring to our journey resides in the district's Office of Accountability. And the data vision and implementation that I had the honor to discuss with you today has been 10 years in the making and is based on the initiatives of a team consisting of many talented analysts. And one of the key things I must share is that a district must continue and build on the successes of the past and enhance rather than replace. And in that spirit, I really want to acknowledge the strong visionary leadership of two key individuals that have played a huge part in the journey, and that is Dr. Michael Chrisman and Dr. Jeanette Silvers, who have both been instrumental in what it is that I'm about to talk to you today. Just a little bit of information about the Rochester City School District from a data perspective. We are the largest district in the state of New York. We have approximately 30,000 students in 64 schools. 65% of our population is African American Black, 22% are Hispanic Latino, 10% are white, and 3% fall into the other racial ethnic categories. 17% of our students are students with disabilities. 10% of our students are English language learners, and 85% of our students qualify for free and reduced lunch. Our Office of Accountability is a central office division focused on the analytic, data governance, federal and state compliance, and performance management and student equity functions of the district. Our journey begins today in the story anyhow, focusing in on two visual cues. In the 2005-2006 school year, the New York State Education Department released a new school report card. On these report cards, the annual yearly progress was indicated by green check marks when AYP was achieved and red X's when it was not. These symbols took on a culture and reputation of their own. More importantly, they provided a visual cue to begin to frame data analysis in the realities of student performance accountability. And this really, as Dr. Wayman was talking about, this is an example of how collaboration began. It brought a group of individuals, educators, around the idea of we have issues that are being illustrated in school report cards and we need to address them. And I noticed there's a lot of questions that are coming through the chat, especially about data literacy. And one of the things that we've done in Rochester, and you'll see in this little presentation, is the element of using requirements or regulatory requirements as leverage to begin conversations on data culture and data focus. As Dr. Wayman had mentioned, that principals have multiple responsibilities, and those responsibilities seem to be continuously piling up by the day. And so being able to siphon off time to focus on each area that they're responsible for can sometimes be overwhelming. And it basically comes down to a prioritization of effort. What do I need to do? And so some of the data regulatory requirements that have come across from the State Education Department have allowed us as a district to focus in on talking about data literacy. So when we look at these symbols, these visual cues are linked to three important numbers in the minds of both building and district leaders. They link to an annual measurable objective, they are linked to a safe harbor target, and they are linked to the actual achievement performance index that the school achieved. Additionally, these visual cues signified a change in accountability paradigms from merely looking at how a large group of students were doing at a particular period of time to examining the achievement of different groupings of students based on demographic and program service membership. So we're looking at how are students with disabilities doing, how are English language learners doing. It's not just the whole or the majority taking the wave of performance for our school. It's looking at how each student, as they are attributed to each group, are doing at a particular point in time. So as we look at the progression, using the visual cue slide as an example of a continual progression, the district facilitated data analysis activities that best accompanied the data reporting requirements that often directly correlate to data that was available for use. Prior to the passage of the No Child Left Behind Act, data was presented through standard reports that were pushed out to schools and district departments. As the New York State Longitudinal Data Warehouse came into the picture and data was easier to access, the need to evolve to create custom data analytics that summarized the data elements found in the longitudinal data system became a necessity. The standard reporting process still remained pivotal, allowing the ability to reference summative data points with other data that was retrieved from the system. So it's, again, making connections, as Dr. Wayman was talking about. With the Race to the Top began the advocacy movement of the masses for access to data. So it was no longer what data is available, it's where can I have access to data. Dashboards and projection reports became a necessity rather than a luxury. The tide changed from wanting data to needing data. And through, at least through New York State's Elementary and Secondary Education Act waiver, it increased the analytic rigor necessary to meet educational progress targets. Data analytics now require inferential data analysis, looking at growth specific to teacher and student characteristics. And in that situation, you're relying on data sets not only at the local level, but from the state level as well. And there's a continuous focus here on how to best use analysts. The human capital component, the people who are working with you in your district to analyze data, is what is going to put you over the top to moving the data agenda in your district, as Dr. Wayman was talking about. Technology is not simply the answer. It's the people who are behind it that are the most important. So to summarize this element, basically, we, over the last 10 years, have moved from an information management paradigm to a knowledge management paradigm. And the progression can best be summarized as moving in this direction, because it's not about just getting the educators the information, but providing them analytic lenses to put information into action. So given the ever-increasing volumes of data and questions that are constructed as they relate to these data points, it is crucial to have a strategic plan in place to align a district's research and analytic agenda. This strategic plan needs to clearly outline how you're going to focus on student achievement, how you're going to focus on teacher performance, how you're going to continuously nurture a data culture. And that data culture is going to be not about what data you want, but what is it that you need. And you have an element where compliance is driving performance, and as performance improves or additional lenses pertaining to performance are created, an additional element of compliance seems to add a layer onto that. So, for example, one of the things that Rochester was one of the only large districts in the state that participated in the state's Race to the Top application process for reporting course teacher linkage data, which allowed them to submit to the federal government. And the interesting element is that as we participated in that process, it allowed us to see where we had gaps linking students to teachers to courses, but it also prepared us for what would then become an element of compliance where the state would require this and also require us to report to teachers student growth measures as they pertain to state assessments. So probably, finally, the biggest element here is the data tools that have evolved across the years. The first was probably around 2002, where the office began to publish data notebooks. And the technological infrastructure in the district wasn't at the point where we could push data out on a common network at that point in time. So these data notebooks were actually created in Excel and printed and provided to each building leader that contained all types of descriptive analysis. That included test scores, but it also included information about students with disabilities, English language learners, other demographic characteristics of the school. And then that moved into data folios as the evolution of computers allowed for the burning of CDs. And these binders were placed on CDs and distributed out to principals with summary statements and that highlighted the key elements to that CD. Once we had an intranet in the district, digital data notebooks were made available. So everything that were found in the printed version, or what was put on CD, was then placed onto a secure SharePoint site. And in that SharePoint site, there was an additional folder that was added that contained confidential student information. So everything else that preceded this were summary or aggregate data reports, but now we are giving student-by-student reports in these digital data notebooks. And only the principal had access to the folder and then could designate as they saw fit who should have access in order to ensure FERPA integrity. Then as we moved on to creating dashboards in the district that have an operational focus, basically it changed the elements of data culture to not looking at just summative data, but looking at more formative information and how that information can fluctuate. And that is a very interesting element that has transcended into the professional development of teachers and principals as they look at data points. That are you looking at a data point that's a data point in time, or are you looking at a data point that is reflective of a longer period of time? And so it's an operational focus versus an evaluative focus. And this is where it becomes very important when a district is implementing a dashboard. You still need to have standard reports that act as a benchmark, that allow for comparisons between what is it that we're seeing and visualizing on today's dashboard compared to what we would average or annually or average see on a report. So today's attendance rate is X, and what was our overall attendance rate for last year, and how do we make those comparisons? So it's very important, but one of the dangers is sometimes when the technology comes in, some of the work that may have been done in a more static fashion is dismissed. And so it's important to keep a balance. Again, you're continuously adding on and improving. And one of the most important things that has been implemented across the district in the last couple of years are data teams. And the data teams serve two functions. They serve an operational function, and they serve an instructional function. And it started off where data teams were charged with the verification of data that was sent to the state education department. And through that mechanism, calibration activities began to talk about, okay, what are the state's requirements? What are the state's business rules? Okay, these are the students that we've reported. Let's take a look at their data. Have we captured this information correctly? One of the most interesting conversations that I think has occurred amongst data teams, especially in high schools, are for those students who have dropped out. And what happens is that as these data teams were formed, one of the first items on their agenda were to validate data that was reflective of their cohort that would be graduating that year. And in some situations, the people who were at the table had lists of students who had dropped out 4 years prior, and none of those individuals were in the school at that time. And so these questions came up to be, well, who is this student? Where did this student go? Why don't we have a record of where the student had gone? It brought a whole other dynamic to the accountability of keeping kids in school and following where kids are going. But the other thing that's even more important with data teams and moving from the operational, and that was the initial setup, is the instructional. So we have this data that's available. What are we going to do? Where is our point of focus going to be? And as Dr. Wayman was talking about for principals, having a topic that they will master each year, a school's data team needs to work collaboratively to define the goals that they want to focus on at any given time. And it's really important. I noticed a lot of the chat correspondence that's going on talking about the importance of teacher buy-in. This is where on that data team you have teachers and you're talking about where do we want to begin using this data for instructional purposes above and beyond what's the regulatory requirements. And it's very interesting when teachers get a list comparing themselves to their peers and how that information is disseminated. It really needs to be done with integrity and with compassion so that it minimizes any type of anxiety that's going to come to that reporting or discussion. I mean, one of the things I think that anyone who's in education today is in a mindset where we all grew up by getting report cards. And those report cards that we got as kids, we got a summative report, and we had to take that report card and share it with our parents. And our parents looked at it and it's like, okay, so this is where you're at. And so oftentimes when we see any type of data that's attributed to ourselves today, we look at it in a summative fashion rather than in a formative fashion. And that in some way that misconception that it's summative is going to be to our disadvantage to have a discussion about improving. So that's one of the key things these data teams in building that culture, deciding where it is that you want to move in the instructional realm and drafting those questions. But also that team should also be in charge of the continuous validation and the implementation of best data practices. And I will stop there.
Great, thanks so much, Brandon. This is Dave Phillips jumping in again, and I'll facilitate our next question and answer session here. And y'all note there's, for those who are paying attention, that's a picture of Anthony Petrosino on the slide, and I'm glad they found one that looks much better than my own. So, but this is Dave talking. I think just I'll start with a couple of clarifying questions, or one clarifying question that came up, Brandon, and then while we are talking through that question, I would invite our audience members to think to and reflect on what you've heard today, both from Jeff and Brandon, and any additional clarifying questions you have or additional information that you'd like. With that said, Brandon, one question that came up in the chat was if you could talk to what is a dashboard in a little more detail about what it looks like and who all at the district and the schools has access to it, that'd be great.
Sure. A dashboard is in the most simplest terms, a visualization of data that resides somewhere. So let's put this, if you think of an Excel file that has a whole bunch of data, and you translate that data into a graph, you're visualizing that information. So what a dashboard does is that it has a whole bunch of different visual cues, so to speak, that's connected to underlying data. So it may be like attendance, for example. A dashboard just takes the underlying data that's in a student management system, pulls that information through a query, and then aggregates it and displays it in a visual fashion such that it's very easy to decipher what's going on. So it may be a meter that's telling you, all right, our attendance today is at the 85% mark. And if a district says that an 85% mark is an acceptable attendance range, it may be indicated with an arrow that's in a green zone. If it was lower than 85%, maybe it's in a yellow zone and then in a red zone. So it's a way to visualize data. So oftentimes you'll just see different types of bar graphs or charts. One of the things that might be very interesting to add to the list of resources today is the President of the United States has his own dashboard for educational performance, and I know that's available online and anybody can see it. So that may be a great example. But it's basically a conglomeration of all these different visual tools that have underlying data behind it, and it summarizes it for you such that you should be able to get a glimpse of the status of something very quickly, just like on your car dashboard.
Right. Great. Thanks, Brandon. And kind of as a follow-up to that, is there access to that for folks in the district as you're building that out? Does that go into the classroom or?
Yes. So the way that we are, you have two different type of dashboards that are basically coming down the line. You have one that through our Race to the Top initiative with the State Education Department, they're pushing down a dashboard, and so everyone across the state of New York can have access to a dashboard system that way. I'm just going to speak specifically to Rochester's dashboard, and we have an Active Directory concept here in Rochester, so all of our staff has a sign-on, and in that Active Directory information, it identifies their role and identifies the level of data they should see. And so the dashboards that they would sign into are automatically configured to what their access to educational records are. So a teacher would log in, the system would recognize them as a teacher, their class list and information pertaining to their students would come up. For a principal, they would sign in, the system would recognize them as a principal, information about their building would come up. Superintendent signs in, recognize that they're the superintendent, and they would have access to data across the district. So it's based upon how that security role setting has been set up, and that's how that's been pushed out. So it started only with district users, then it was moved down to principals, and subsequently is being moved down for teachers to access.
Great. Okay, thanks, Brandon. It's a great explanation of the dashboard, and I think how it's being used and how it sounds like it's being implemented. Not just at the leadership level in the district, but all the way down into the classroom. And one question that's related that has come up is you talked quite a bit about the development of the data system over time and that progression. What things have you done to help with the buy-in of the implementation and rollout of that data system in your district?
It has had a lot to do with our team going out and working with schools individually. So one of the there's a lot of activities that go on through the school improvement process that allow us to piggyback on and work with schools as they are drafting their improvement plans. So the school improvement process and the documentation that schools have to come up with is very data specific. And so oftentimes we would go out to schools, work with their school-based planning teams in the drafting of goals and where to access the data that they would need to continuously monitor. It's definitely a continuous customer service approach, and oftentimes, we'll help field questions and provide custom analysis. We, on average, get between 1,000 and 2,000 unique requests for analysis a year, and that's generally within the district.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Brandon. And Jeff, would you have any follow-ups to that, just in your experience with your work in the districts in terms of the data dashboards and finding buy-in for their use?
Well, I think, I'm reminded of something that somebody told me 20 years ago when I was working as a statistician, and I was talking about ways to help support our organization's users, that they told me it's always about software. And so I think it's just critically important to put interesting software and useful software in front of the user. That said, Brandon's done a good job of describing what a dashboard is and the sorts of things that they have in Rochester's dashboard. I'll just add to that with a look to the future, that I think it's really going to be interesting to find out what we can learn about how often and how varied we can push things out to people. You know, when I get on Amazon, I buy a book, and immediately it says, oh, other people that bought this book also bought this. Sometimes that's helpful, sometimes it's not. They're learning this with targeted ads. You know, that if you've done these particular searches on the web, then they're going to give you a certain amount of ads. And I'm interested to see what we can do with education about that. In fact, I would like to see us be able to connect users. You know, if I sit down in front of my dashboard and look at these types of data, I would love it if it popped up and said, hey, these groups or these users or whatever have also investigated that. Maybe you want to connect with them and talk to them about what they found.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. And this is, I think, an interesting follow-up that might be interesting for both of you to talk to is the question, I think it relates a little bit to resources and also, although we're the Urban School Improvement Alliance, I know many of our participants today are from districts that would probably not qualify as urban, more towards the rural end. And both in rural and urban districts, there can be a challenge with actually having the robust systems in place. And would you be able to talk to, I think, data use in an instance where that might be the case, where they're still in the development stage in terms of getting the data systems online?
Yeah, I saw that question come through, and I think it's an important one because, you know, the stuff that Brandon's talking about is really state-of-the-art, and my little description of what the future might look like is futuristic. But the truth is that there are districts that just don't have this sort of technology. And to those folks and to the questioner, I would say, don't let it be a barrier. Yes, your district might not have been able to provide you this great comprehensive data system, but you can still do a lot with Excel. You can still do a lot with Microsoft Access. You'd be surprised at how many things you can link with those easily available data sets, and keep plugging. I mean, you know, we can have all the technology we want, but there's a certain element of truth to the statement that if you can't do this with pencil and paper, you couldn't do it with technology anyway. So I say keep pressing on, put what you can together. One of the things that I hope for in the future is that the vendors will figure out some way to be able to service these districts that aren't able to provide them the large cash cow that some of these larger districts want to. I mean, I grew up in a rural area, and I guarantee you my school district isn't served well by one of these systems because it's not in a vendor's interest to serve them. You know, you don't make enough money off that. I don't fault the vendors for that. I just hope we can find a solution to the problem.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, if I were sitting in a rural district, this would be my my recommendation. Number one, depending on what state you're in, like New York State, for example, is a race to the top state and has invested a considerable amount of money into rolling out a statewide dashboard platform that will include all school districts regardless of size. So I would check in with your, state education agencies and see what is being done and how you can partner with them on that process, or at least get a timeline as far as when that information would be rolled out. Other thing is, to complement Jeff's suggestion is, a lot of the technology that we have on our computers we can use to create reports and begin a process. And another thing that's helpful with that is if you have any higher educational institutions in your area, reach out to them, whether it be their economics department, whether it be their education departments. There are people who are looking for projects, and they may help you as far as a resource to begin to build a foundation for an analytic platform or what have you. The other thing is that connecting with other districts. And one of the things that in Rochester we're always open to talking to any district about things and recognizing that the resource elements are different for everybody. But the interesting thing that I found is that no matter what district a person is in, if they are excited about data, they'll find other people who are excited about data, and there's a synergy that comes from that. So,
I'll follow up on that real quick. Brandon, I'm really glad that you mentioned the state data systems. I'd forgotten about that. He's right. There are a handful of states that have stuff that's really usable. Probably, if you're in one of those states, you already know about it. But you can look into it. As he mentioned, New York, Arkansas has got a really good program going. Oregon, there are a few states that have that. There are a lot more states that are working on it. So even if you don't have access to one right now, keep your ear to the ground, and they may be able to do you some good.
Great. Thanks both for the great comments. Great comments there. I'm not currently seeing additional questions from the chat, but I will give a few more minutes to again invite participants to ask any last questions they'd like regarding how what you've heard today might apply to improvement in your own district, any questions you might have about future research in this direction. And while we will wait for just any additional questions, in the meantime, for Jeffrey and Brandon both, I would ask, what would you recommend for those in roles as policy and decision makers in their organizations that are on the phone today who would be interested in taking a next step of more effectively utilizing data to inform instruction? What would be that first next step that you might recommend?
I think our silence is telling.
Well, if I may, the first thing that comes to my mind is that policymakers have definitely set a lot of ideas out and have enacted upon them for districts to follow through with. I think the next step policymakers need to do is to circle back now. And they need to see how their policies have affected districts. I mean, there's definitely an element of data drowning in certain ways, especially when you come to every piece of data that a school principal is accountable for. And the reporting you have so many different accountability elements to data now that you really need to check in and see how much is it helping and how much is it detracting as far as what some of these requirements are.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think this idea of circling back is really important. You take, there have been accountability policies before No Child Left Behind, but No Child Left Behind really brought attention to it. And No Child Left Behind was once you got past the state test requirement, was very hands-off on how schools and districts should do this. And the explosion of research that follows showed that a lot of schools and districts did the best they could with it, but some of them didn't make very good decisions. And I think there's enough research on this now for policymakers to be able to circle back, like Brandon said, and figure out some ways that they can put in supports for this stuff. I'm hopeful that the policy environment doesn't continue with the direction of that one number is going to tell us everything about a kid's learning, and that if we can go back to what we know is true, which is that multiple measures, triangulation, looking at the whole kid, are important, and we can write that into policy. Like Anna says, I just hope they circle back.
Great. Thanks for taking a crack at that question. I know that was a tough one, and one that just came up from our presenters that I think is really on point that does come up is when looking at information with the leadership team, or I'd extend this question even to the learning community, when specific concerns come up about a teacher or administrator so that it does not come across as threatening. Do you have any insights?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to my mind in that situation, we take confidentiality incredibly seriously in our office. And if it comes down to a situation where we see that there's just one school that's really hanging in the balance, and needs assistance, the first element is you can I can't say the word, but just make it an anonymous type of situation, that we have a school that's in trouble. This is what we see is going on, and build the conversation with that anonymity at first, and then bring in more details as far as who the school is, who's involved, because oftentimes, when you initially bring that information, it's people have their preconceived biases, and it really depends on the situation. If it's a situation where you can continuously keep it anonymous and incorporate a best practice, which then will assist that school and assist all schools, then you can implement it across the district. But one of the things that we found in building partnerships with schools and being able to answer their questions is that it's this almost like attorney-client privilege in many ways, unless our office is given a directive by the superintendent or the Board of Education where they want certain pieces of information about a school. But it's not a situation where we're whistleblowing to upper management about a situation a school may find itself in as they're looking at their data.
Yeah, I also think I just think it's critical for leadership to clearly and frequently forward two tenets. One of them is that we are going to use data to help us learn more about educating the kids. In other words, this is about kids' education. It's not about putting the finger on anybody, and it's not about replacing anybody. We just want to know more about what these kids need. Second thing that I think they have to forward is that teachers, and principals and other educators, we don't think these data replace your professional judgment. In fact, your professional judgment is the glue that we need to hold all this together. We think the data can inform your professional judgment, but you guys are the pros, and we just want to help.
Have we lost you, David?
Thank you. Just found my mute button. Apologies for that. And thank you, Jeff. And Brandon, again, for those questions. Is there any other questions that you would like to ask each other, questions or comments for each other, before we turn it back over to Andrew to wrap up for today?
I don't. I want to say publicly I really enjoyed Brandon's presentation, and I'm glad he's doing that work there in Rochester.
Ditto. I've enjoyed hearing more about the framework that you presented, and it was quite enjoyable for me as well.
Yeah, I also want to say thanks to the participants. I've done some of these webinars before, and this was really, this was good. The participants out there put in a lot of good questions and interacted well. I really enjoyed this, and I learned a lot out of it. So thank you to all the participants, too. And nice job to the REL people and the USIA people for putting this on. Really professionally done.
So
okay.
Thank you Sorry.
Go ahead, Andrew. Go ahead.
So thank you, Dave, for managing that discussion. And thank you both, Jeff and Brandon, for all the information you brought to this. You may have noticed, Jeff, somebody wants to come and study with you.
I'll take
one of the other. Sorry?
That's great. We'll take them all.
Okay. One of the things I wanted to mention is this resource guide that might be useful. Jeff Wayman is one of the co-authors. It's available off the web if you want to. Just Google using student achievement data to support instructional decision making, and you can download it as a PDF. It was financed by the people who financed this REL and in fact this webinar. So if you want to follow up, that's one resource. And I know that there were links to some of Jeff Wayman's material as well, published articles, and so that's another place to go in addition. Thanks to you all, and I want to reinforce that please take the survey. You'll see at the bottom, either by clicking on the link right on the screen, or clicking on the link down below. It says right below this screen, which says take the survey. We want to have your feedback. It's important to us and to our longevity. We appreciate your time. We look forward to hearing from you if you want to follow up with us. And we're part of a nascent group which looks to expand and develop a body of research. So until next time, we will sign off.
Thank you, Andrew. And this is, I want to thank our presenters and our production team today. The technical producer was Chantel Darrow. The audio producer was Shanna Russ. And I'm Peter Orn, the dissemination manager here at the REL Northeastern Islands. Thanks for joining in. All the registrants for today's session will receive an email in a few days with a link to the webinar archive and any kind of Q&A that we weren't able to get to in this session. Thanks, and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.